Good evening, and welcome to the Christopher B. Smith Raphael Film Center. I'm David Templeton, the host and co-producer of Science on Screen, and we are here tonight for a screening of Anaconda with special guests, human and reptile. This is our third in a row. We've done a little spate of them over the last few weeks, and it's nice to see human beings here. I gotta ask, is there anybody here for whom this is their first time back in a theater since all this began? Wow. Well, welcome. You picked a good one. I have been looking forward to tonight. Science on Screen, of course, is a series in which we find a fun movie and we screen it, and then we bring some people who actually know what was going on in it and can say what was real and what isn't, and have a little fun with that. So tonight we're going to have two very special, actually more than two special guests. The human guests are Bella Sessi and Rebecca Abrams from the Petaluma Wildlife Museum, which is possibly I think it is the only student-run wildlife museum in the country. It's up in Petaluma. And they have brought a few animal ambassadors with them. A little smaller than the star of the movie tonight, thankfully. So before we go further, let's define a couple of terms. What is a cult film? The Oxford Dictionary defines it as something, typically a movie or book, that is popular or fashionable among a particular group or section of society. That is a cult classic. Paul Fishbein, the producer of the documentary Time Warp, the greatest cult films of all time, defines it as a cult film or cult movie, also commonly referred to as a cult classic, is a film that has acquired a cult following. That makes sense. A cult following is a film, book, musical artist, television series, or video game, among other things, that is said to have a cult following when it has a small but very passionate fan base. A small but very passionate fan base. I'm just curious, is there anyone with us tonight who identifies as a member of the Anaconda cult fan base? Me too. Tonight will be my 12th time I have seen this movie all the way through. Sometimes you just become a cult member, whether you know why or not. Now, Anaconda was released in 1997. That was 24 years ago. It was Jennifer Lopez's second feature film after making Selena. Nearly a quarter century later, Anaconda often lands on lists of the greatest cult films of the last 50 years. John Waters, who defined a cult film as something that is a movie where three smart people liked it and it lost all the money it cost to make it. He actually is on the record as saying that this movie didn't scare him except for how popular it was. And strangely, if a cult film is something that only three people like and loses money, maybe this isn't a cult film, because it was made for $45 million, and during its initial theatrical run, it made $136.8 million. So a bunch of people went to see it. What makes it a cult film is that those people went home and kept watching it over and over and over again. 24 years ago, when it first came out, I was writing a column called Talking Pictures, in which I would take interesting people to interesting films, and we would have a conversation. At that time, I saw this movie with a guy named Ken Howell, who was the snake handler at Steinhardt Aquarium in the California Academy of Science, back before the original building was torn down and the new one was replaced it went up in 2008. One of the things that Ken said at that time, I went and I looked at my original article. He said, sometimes when you know a little too much about natural history, it takes away some of the fun of a movie. Like in Tarzan movies, suddenly Tarzan is fighting piranhas or something. In Africa, piranhas are a South American species. I just try to roll with it, he said. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're gonna roll with it. This is a fun movie about a giant snake, and it has some of the most memorably preposterous snake moments ever put on film. I'm curious, is there anybody who will be seeing Anaconda for the first time? Okay. One more thing. Ken Howell did say that his advice for anybody seeing this movie is, it's best if you just think of it as a comedy. So then again, he said, when I asked him if snakes scared him, I mean, he's a snake handler. He said there wasn't much that he was afraid of, but he said the world is really a very amazing place. Instead of fearing it, I'd rather just be fascinated. So in that spirit, we're about to start this. Let me tell you briefly what's going to happen. We're going to show the movie, and then afterwards we're going to show a short film about the Wildlife Museum, and then our guests are going to come up with their guests, and we'll have a talk about some of the things in the film, and then we'll introduce you to some reptiles. But we have a little treat here. It turns out that our videographer has some experience with anacondas, and he has brought an anaconda shed. This is the skin that an anaconda let go of. So Dan and I are going to unroll it for you, but would you tell us a little bit about how you came to possess this?
I fought very hard for it, just like in the movie. No. This was a 16-foot green anaconda. There are 4 species of anacondas. This is the largest. And she was about 16 or 17 feet. That shed is missing the head. Unfortunately, it broke off. But yeah, there it is. You can see it. It's not as large as you might think after watching the movie. But yeah, so that was an adult female. Yeah.
Did you tell us the name?
Her name was Sally. Yeah.
Sally the Anaconda.
Sally the Anaconda. Yeah.
That sounds like a children's book series. Yeah. All right. We will put the snake skin away and ask you to just enjoy the film. There you go. So from the museum, please welcome Bella and Rebecca. And friends. So that was your first time seeing that movie, right? Yes, it was. We're going to have questions. We'll wait a little bit to introduce the friends. Let's talk about this for a little bit. So this is Bella here, and Rebecca is a board member. And Bella, you work with the snakes.
I do.
So just like off the top of your head, first impression, I heard you laughing quite a bit.
Yeah, it's just a little bit ridiculous, some of the stuff that was in there. Just a little bit. I mean, most of it is really behavioral. Snakes are definitely ambush predators. They won't chase anything. They won't actively hunt anything. They basically sit there, and if something makes a big splash right next to them, then they might bite it. But for the most part, I've never heard of a snake chasing people or chasing really anything. I don't know. It was a little bit comical just to see any kind of snake acting that way. In my experience, very much more ambush predators, and then as soon as that is interrupted, as soon as they aren't in a hunting mind space, they're pretty docile. Even snakes that are quote unquote aggressive, it's usually either a feeding strike or they're really afraid of you and they think you're going to eat them. I've never seen a snake be like attacking someone.
Well, I have a bunch of questions from the movie, but Rebecca, do movies like this in some ways help with a museum like yours in that maybe they increase interest in wildlife even if it's unfactual?
Yeah, so in addition to being a board member, I'm also a middle school science teacher. So I get information like this from my kids and from visitors at the museum all the time. And a huge part of what we do is counter misinformation, but also, you're right, this does spark interest, and it's our job and the students who work at the museum, it's their job to gently correct people in the direction of facts. And I think the unfortunate thing about something like this is that it could perpetuate fear of these animals. When, like Bella said, snakes are shy, really, really shy. And moreover, they're physically low energy animals. They don't produce their own body heat. So they are doing everything physically possible to conserve energy. And so a big snake eats once a month. It can go 6 months without eating. So the fact that this snake is eating daily, 3 times a day, more, that's just patently absurd. But so when you see a rattlesnake out on a trail, it's not hunting, it's trying to get warm enough to start moving for the day. Same thing with lizards and all that. And so it definitely does not want to interact with you. And so the only problem with movies like this is that it builds fear. And so people, unfortunately, will have an aggressive response toward docile animals. And so you get unfortunate things like rattlesnake roundups and things like that, where people go out and harm these really beautiful animals that are key to our ecosystems.
Well, evidently with the movie Jaws, it really increased people's fear of sharks. And sharks are predators. They're a little different, but people swore off going into the ocean at all after that movie. I don't know that this quite had that kind of effect on people.
No.
The difficult thing with snakes is that they live on almost every single continent, except if you want to move to Antarctica. You might be able to escape them there in certain areas, but no matter where you go in the world, even if you live in a city, most of the time there are snakes somewhere. So they're a lot more hard to escape than sharks. Sharks, if you're in the ocean, there's a shark somewhere, because the ocean is a big ocean, it's one body of water. Another thing is that snakes are not always this big. We brought one snake with us today who's small enough that you might not be able to see him very well from the seats. And it's actually the closest relative that we have at the museum to an anaconda. It's about this long. So they're, I think, just harder to escape from, but people definitely have almost more fear of snakes than sharks. I would say, in my experience at least, people are terrified of snakes.
I think it's partially that they are so different from us. They move in a way that is, to us, just absolutely bizarre, right? They have no limbs, so they slither, right? And so they can make sudden movements that we don't anticipate. And then they are cold and smooth, which our brain interprets as like slimy. And so if you're not anticipating it, and if you touch them lightly, it tickles them. And so they twitch, and this can really startle people, so it can make them slightly more afraid. And so one of the things that we really try to encourage with people and who are touching snakes for the first time is just be really calm, because it will make the snake calm. And snakes actually really like being handled because you're warm. They love warm-handed people. They'll like to curl up in your sleeve, in the pocket of your jacket. They think that's wonderful.
What I think we're going to do a little later on, those of you who know that there are snakes right over there, we'll have them show them from the stage, and then we'll say goodbye, and I think anybody who would like to have an interaction with the snake can just wait, and they can either bring them to you or you can come up to the stage. But we're not going to be tossing snakes out for you to interact with. Okay, a couple things from the movie. In this case, this snake made a lot of noise. He screamed, he or she. I think it was a female, right? Because
They said female.
I would assume
That was the
female,
implication?
just based on the size. Female snakes are usually much larger than males. They actually kind of have opposite sexual dimorphism that all kinds of humans and mammals have. Most of the time for us, males are larger. Snakes are exactly the opposite. So,
do they make any kind of sound, anything like these dinosaur screams that this one is making?
No. No. They can hiss. Hissing is basically loud breathing. They do it for a number of reasons. Sometimes they can have respiratory issues and you can hear them breathing kind of loudly. Sometimes if they're just breathing more quickly than usual, you can hear them breathing a little more. And sometimes they'll do it if they're very stressed or feeling really defensive.
It sounds like they're snorting at you. They go.
Yeah, it's essentially loud breathing.
Yeah.
It's a little bit wheezy sometimes, depending on how good their respiratory health is, things like that. You would never ever hear a snake scream. You would never hear a snake make a noise. They don't have the right vocal cords or anything like that to make a noise like that.
They also don't have ears. They don't have external ears at all.
They don't have external ears. So if you look at a snake, if you look at our snakes later, they don't have holes for their ears. They don't have flaps for their ears. There's just nothing there. They do have an internal eardrum, but that mainly helps them feel like vibrations or hear much louder noises. So their sense of hearing is not as well developed as ours, and they don't use sound to communicate in any way, aside from maybe hissing.
I was thinking that those were maybe crocodile or alligator hisses. That's what those sounded like to me.
That's what it sounded like to me as well. Most of the snakes that you hear have a much quieter hiss, in my experience. Sometimes if they're very, very feeling defensive, like they think they're about to be attacked, they can be a little bit louder, but for the most part, it's not quite what we were hearing by any means.
Tail rattling, though.
That is a thing, yes.
A lot of species will do that. Even corn snakes and
gopher snakes are a big one.
Hognose, because they're all imitating rattlesnakes. And so they do this super, super rapid tail shaking, and if it's against anything, it sounds just like a rattlesnake, because they know other things don't want to be near a rattlesnake. So it's just mimicry.
Just smart snakes.
Yeah, it's more of a evolutionary coincidence than it is them saying, hey, if I make this noise, this thing might go away. It's more of like a fear response that it's ingrained in them.
Wow.
They don't really think about like what's going to happen if they make the noise. They just do it when they're stressed.
Okay, so speaking of their tails, this snake could be occupied with its head and then grab something with its tail and bring it over. Are there any snakes that can use their tails like arms and hands?
If there are, I have never met one or heard of one or anything like that. The general thing that you would see in a constrictor, like an anaconda is generally known as a type of boa. It's a type of constrictor. They will strike with their mouth, so they will bite something and then they will wrap around it with their body. And that's how they constrict. They don't usually let go of something with their mouth while they're constricting it unless it's already dead. And so they would never be doing anything like that with the tail and the head. That was probably one of the more comical parts for me.
Using it as a whip. That was great.
And also just the way it was wrapping around. Maybe this is more of like a anatomical thing, I guess. Usually they don't wrap around like from the tail end up. It would be more from the middle out. I don't know if that even makes sense, but that's just what I've seen feeding snakes. So.
Okay, another question from the movie. Is there such a thing as reptile tranquilizer?
You know, this is one that I don't have a great answer to. I know that there are a lot of drugs that people will use to put animals under anesthesia, snakes and lizards and things under anesthesia for surgery, which I guess would be kind of like a tranquilizer.
It's dangerous to do that. Snakes,
very dangerous.
Snakes only have one functioning lung. Each species has either the right or the left. It varies. And so putting a reptile under anesthesia, one, you have to find a vet who has that skill. They're not common. And then putting an animal of that size, they tend to be fairly small. It's not something that's generally encouraged.
Yes. Any kind of anesthesia, any kind of surgery for snakes is much, much more risky than it is for any kind of mammal. Partly, I would assume, because it's not as commonly practiced. So something like a dog there's probably millions of people who've done surgeries on dogs throughout human history, and so there's a lot of literature on it. There's a lot of studies that have been done, versus snakes are kind of one of those animals historically where if a snake is injured, people are more likely to throw a party than they are to do surgery on the snake, unfortunately. Yeah. Or people caring for snakes, snakes, especially snakes that are easy to breed, if they have issues, are not always likely to get as good a care as a dog or a cat. So there's not as much literature around it. They're very sensitive to certain drugs, and they have a very hard time recuperating from surgery as well. So coming out of surgery, they can seem like they're fine, and then suddenly they crash, or they have some sort of complication. There's a lot that goes into it. But yes, there are drugs for snakes. I guess that's a very roundabout way of answering your question. There are drugs that they use for snakes. A lot of them are more general drugs that they can use on other animals as well. But yes.
I was talking to a friend yesterday whose girlfriend has had all kinds of animals, including snakes, and he said that once she had a snake that kind of drowned, it got into water deeper, and in this they were throwing what looked like non-water snakes into the water, saying, "Goodbye, back to your mama." But he said that she once gave mouth-to-mouth to a drowned snake and brought it back. Do you think that's possible, or was something else going on and she thought that she was getting its lung functioning again by breathing into its mouth?
I couldn't say. Based off of just the description, I have no idea. Snakes don't generally breathe through their mouth. They're not like humans in that way. There was a couple parts of the movie where you can see kind of the anatomy of the inside of the snake's mouth, which was actually more or less accurate. Mm-hmm. The teeth, we were arguing maybe the teeth were a little bit strange. But the actual inside of the mouth was fairly accurate. You could see there's like a little hole kind of in their throat. That's called a glottis. Pipe? Yeah. So that's the part of their throat that connects to their lungs. It's very small, and the rest of their entire throat is just for eating. So they don't really breathe out of their throat very often. That hole in the glottis is basically just there for while they're eating, so that they can still breathe while they're swallowing a giant prey item. So yeah, it would be very difficult to give a snake mouth to mouth. You'd probably have to go through the nostrils or something like that.
So what did you think of the point of view swallowing shot when the mouth opened up?
That one was a little strange. I would kind of compare it to a human swallowing. You don't see our entire throat open up or anything like that. And that's kind of what it looked like with the snake. It's this, that as different as their anatomy is, they're still swallowing something. So it's still just their muscles are moving it down to their stomach. And that's literally all it is. So
the jaw was nice, though.
The jaw?
Yeah.
I didn't notice that part.
Snakes, so your jaw is in two pieces. Snakes have, I'd say it's in four pieces, except it's not. It's looser between the two halves. And so when they're eating, they basically walk each quarter of their jaw onto the food at a time. This is what allows them to eat things that are so large. Like egg-eating snakes can eat whole eggs and so on and so forth. And they actually showed that when it was eating one of the humans. You could really see how its jaw expanded out into a huge rectangle, kind of. That was not terrible.
Yeah, the only thing that was strange about that was the speed at which it happened. That's another thing about snakes that a lot of people aren't aware of. They can usually only eat something that's about as big around as they are, which makes sense because they're basically one long tube. So if you have something that's too big, it maybe won't fit in their stomach as well. They can have problems in their intestine. And so generally they go for prey that's about as big around as they are or somewhat smaller. Anything bigger would be not only difficult for them to swallow, but difficult to digest.
So this leads us to the big question of regurgitation. This does have probably the best regurgitation moment ever put on film.
That was nasty.
When Jon Voight comes out and then winks at her.
It was disgusting.
It's disgusting.
It was that like ectoplasm that he was covered in. That was real nice.
I have seen a snake regurgitate once in my 8 years of working with snakes. And it was because someone didn't realize that it had been fed the day before. Something about snakes, we've talked about, they're cold-blooded, they don't produce their own heat. They need to basically sit in a warm spot and bake for a while, digest.
They're very slow.
Their digestion is very, very slow, which is one of the reasons why some larger snakes can eat once a month, once every 2 months, and be completely healthy. It takes them a very long time to digest a meal. So with a lot of snakes, if you handle them within 24 or 48 hours of them eating, they can regurgitate out of stress. And that's really the only reason I've seen that happen. It's a defense mechanism for them, because if you think about it in the wild, if they had just eaten and they were attacked by something or something was chasing them and they regurgitated their meal, they would be much lighter and easier to run away. It's something that some other animals do as well. So that's really the only reason I've ever seen it happen. But I will say, the one time I did see that happen, again, someone had not realized that the snake ate the day prior, and then we were handling it, and it was just as disgusting as the movie.
They have
the smell?
super strong digestive enzymes. They eat things whole. They can't chew. And so their digestive enzymes break down bone, fur, everything. So when they defecate, it looks like slightly solid bird poop. There's nothing identifiable left. Yeah.
So was there anything about the snake action in this that you enjoyed as people who hung around with snakes? Was that kind of fun, even though it was a fantasy version of a snake?
It was definitely an interesting watch. Some of the parts, like when they had all the snakes on the boat, I thought it was nice, or we thought it was nice that they used actual native South American snakes. We were talking about how, if you've ever seen the movie Indiana Jones, they use corn snakes, which are native to North America, and very, very common in the pet trade. So if you've ever been to like a PetSmart, they probably have corn snakes there because they're one of the most common pet snakes, which is why they're easy to use for movies. But they actually had anacondas, and I think the one snake that I saw that wasn't an anaconda was red-tailed boa, which is also a South American snake. That was really cool.
Have you ever seen the impression of something it ate through its skin, like Owen Wilson's face?
Perfectly
That
outlined.
we were laughing kind of
That
hard
was
at that one.
fantastic.
I was wheezing a little bit. Yeah, no, I can't say that I have. That's not something that happens. It's just
It's kind of one of those things that, like Bella said, when you feed a snake, you aim to feed it something that's the same diameter as its widest point. So if it's the diameter of the microphone, you aim for something that big at its widest point. Even if you think it can't get it through its mouth, it can. And so if you have fed it something that creates a bulge, you've basically fed it something too big. And so clearly Owen Wilson was too big.
Well, I know we want to get to the snakes, but we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, if anyone has any questions. In the back.
I hated that part. My name's Mateo.
Oh.
No. I cried a little bit.
oh gosh.
Anybody else? Well, you ready for the snakes? Just before you show the snakes, I do want to announce, for those who don't know it, I looked it up today, and it has been released recently that there will be an Anaconda remake.
Oh god.
They're not doing yet another sequel. There's already been 4 or 5 sequels, including one that was a mashup with a movie about a giant crocodile. It was kind of a Kong versus Godzilla thing with Anaconda versus giant crocodile. But they're just going to flat out remake it, and it's in production right now. So we have that to look forward to. So how do you want to do this?
We can come down to the front, and then if you're welcome to come up and meet the snakes.
Why don't you show us from here first, so those who don't want to get too close.
We can talk about them a little bit, and then when we're done, maybe people can come up.
Okay.
Do you want to start with Diggy?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think Rebecca's going to get them out for me, and I will just talk about them a little bit. So the snake that she's taking out right now is actually the closest relative that we have. to the anaconda. The anaconda is a type of boa. This is also a type of boa. He's a Kenyan sand boa, so a much less of a water dweller. This one, he lives in the desert. They are more terrestrial. They actually will live under the ground, something called fossorial. They live under the ground, or they dig, hence the name Diggy. Yes, a lot of the times, most of the animals are named by the kids, whether it's the summer camp kids who are between like 6 and 12, or the high school kids. So yes, Diggy is somewhere around 7 years old. He might be older than that, we're not sure, because he came to us at this size about 6 years ago. And yes, he is a full-grown male. If he was a female, he could be probably twice that size. I've seen some that are about this big around, same species, just a female and larger. He's actually kind of on the small side for a male, but he's never been a great eater for us, so he just kind of eats when he wants. And that's one of the strange things about snakes that a lot of people aren't aware of, is that it's actually harder to get them to strike at stuff than it is to get them to not strike at stuff. With this guy, we don't ever have to worry about him biting us. He's never even opened his mouth at someone. He's never hissed at someone. He's never tried anything. But he also won't eat food sometimes. So it's really hard with a lot of captive snakes just to get them to eat. They're very susceptible to stress. If their temperature is wrong, if the humidity is wrong, if they have the wrong substrate, if people are handling them too much, they'll just stop eating. And sometimes it has nothing to do with that. Sometimes they just decide that they're not hungry for a couple months, and then they'll start eating again, and they're totally fine. We just try to pay attention to their weight, and he's been a pretty stable weight since he came in. He's gained probably 10 grams, which is a lot for him because he's tiny. He eats frozen thawed mice, just kind of like tiny mice. Yeah, we only feed frozen thawed rats at the museum. We just find it to be more humane, actually, for both the rat and for the snake. A lot of people think that it's like better for the snake, or the snake will like it better if you feed it live rats. And in a lot of cases, when people do that regularly, especially if they're not very careful about it, the rats can actually injure the snake quite badly. Some snakes I've seen have been blinded. Some snakes have scars all over their body. They can actually be killed by the rats that you're feeding them. So it's much more humane for the rat as well, just to have it humanely euthanized, and then we feed them to the snake frozen thawed. It can be a little bit harder to get them to eat that way. It kind of depends.
When I did that interview I mentioned with Ken Howell at the museum in San Francisco, we did the interview in his office underneath the museum, and at one point there was a knock on the door, and there was a UPS guy who said, "I have a shipment of frozen mice. Do they go here?"
That's us.
There's no Purina snake chow?
Yeah, it's a little bit less easy than feeding your dog like chicken or something like that, because it's in those like nice little kibble things, right? And you don't have to think about the fact that there's animals in there. So for a lot of people, it's like, wow, that's an actual rat, and I have to feed it to a snake. But you know, a lot of things eat meat. Humans eat meat. Dogs and cats eat meat. It's just kind of in a different form for snakes. They don't really like the kibble thing, so. Yeah, that's one thing that a lot of people who are getting a first snake, or who just in general are a little bit afraid of snakes, egg-eating snakes don't have teeth. So it's kind of nice. They really can't bite you. They can't really do anything. And their diet is completely eggs. So they just swallow an egg whole, and then they basically spit the crushed shell back out, and that's how they eat.
I'm glad we don't eat like that.
Yeah, it's kind of gross.
Do they, when I call snakes, they sometimes urinated on me?
Yes, that's a thing that can be caused by increased motion. So just they're moving around a lot, they're getting a little bit warmer, and their metabolism is maybe speeding up. It can also be caused by stress, which basically for snakes, anytime you look at them or touch them or hold them, they can be okay with it, some of them, and for some of them it's just stressful. And so we try to limit that, again, around feeding times and stuff like that. Sometimes if they're a little stressed out, they can urinate or something, something like that.
Do they drink water?
Yes. It's actually, depending on the species, can be kind of hard to catch. Some of our snakes I've seen drink water multiple times. Some of them I've never ever seen drink water. A lot of them prefer to soak in the water, so we try to provide them with water dishes that are big enough that they can fit their entire body into it, because especially when it's around time for them to shed, it's helpful for them to soak in the water and just get really like moisturized so that the shed comes off really easily. But that's one of their favorite ways to hydrate themselves. Diggy, I don't think I've ever seen him drink. I don't think I've ever seen him touch water or enjoy water.
So what is that device called, the snake hook?
It's exactly what it's called. It's a snake hook. So the reason that we use snake hooks is for our safety. Like I said earlier, I was explaining that snakes are ambush predators. So if you open a snake's enclosure and reach your hand right in there, the snake is probably going to be sleeping or just hanging out, and basically all they do all day is wait for food to walk by. So that's when you're most likely to be struck at, is when you're first reaching into their enclosure. What we've noticed with our snakes is that once they're out, once that kind of feeding response has been interrupted, they act completely different, very docile, and very easy to handle. And so with some of our snakes, we don't find it necessary to do that, especially Diggy, because he has no feeding response whatsoever and will never strike at anything, even if we want him to. But Kiara, on the other hand, is a great eater, and sometimes will strike at stuff without looking first. So we just use the snake hook to kind of let her know that we're there, and sometimes to help lift her out.
I heard that poisonous snakes prefer to not slide off of a snake hook where non-poisonous will slide off. Is that misinterpreted that?
I actually have really never worked with venomous snakes. Yeah, we don't have the permits to work with them, and they're also just kind of a hazard that we don't really need. So I couldn't say that for sure, but when I've seen people handle venomous snakes with hooks, it's essentially the same. One interesting thing that I've found is that a lot of people don't actually know the difference between poisonous and venomous. Most of you probably won't know. Really, the only people who know are either arachnid enthusiasts or snake enthusiasts, from my experience at least. And I've even read a book from, I think, National Geographic that called Snakes Poisonous. Venomous things are things that bite you and make you sick. Poisonous things are things that you bite that make you sick. So something like a poison dart frog, if it has poison on its skin, if it is something that you eat, like a toxic plant, that's poisonous. Most snakes, if they bite you, that's called venomous, yeah. It's something that maybe 0.001% of the population of the world knows, but I find it very important. So this is Kiara. Kiara is a Burmese python. She's actually a juvenile, believe it or not. These are one of the largest snakes in the world. Similar to anacondas, they are, I think, one of the largest by weight or something like that. She's around 20 pounds at this weight. Pure muscle, yes. And they're actually known, Burmese pythons, for being one of the more docile of the large snakes. The other two of the largest species of snake in the world are anacondas, of course, and reticulated pythons, both of which aren't known for being particularly handleable. Burmese pythons, on the other hand, are fairly easy to handle, aside from the fact that they're giant and heavy. So Kiara basically will just sit on people. This is what most snakes do, by the way, when you're handling them. Not really trying to eat you, not really trying to bite anything. They just kind of, they just kind of sit there.
Pretends I'm a tree.
Yeah. Do they ever move quickly? They can. Most of the time it's when they're very warm. They will move much more quickly because they have more energy. Also, if they're very nervous. She's just trying to descend right now. She's just falling on the floor. They're not really tree snakes, so she's just going back to her natural habitat, which is the floor.
Yeah.
So the name, Kiara, what was that from one of the students?
Yeah, one of the high school students named her, which is pretty par for the course. Sometimes we have voting on what the animals' names are. Like some people will come up with names, and then all the students will vote on which one they think is their favorite.
My
But-
brother had a boa constrictor once, about 6 feet long, that was named Napoleon Pull-Apart.
That is a good name. We
Evidently.
had a lizard once. The kind of lizard is called an agama, and we named him Barack. So he was Barack Agama.
My brother got Napoleon from somebody who had another snake called Julius Squeezer.
I'm getting some ideas right now. I'm gonna make some suggestions next time we get a new snake. Kiara's around 10 feet long right now. When we've measured her before, it's like kind of a 4-person job. 3 people just to like kind of hold her down on the ground so she's not going anywhere, and then another person to like get some tape and like measure her out so we can figure out her actual length. But the estimate is around 10 feet. She is still a juvenile, yeah. So she's got some ways to go. I think the average for female Burmese pythons is usually around like 15 feet or so. There's a pretty big range for snakes because it really just depends on how much you feed them. A lot of people think if you keep a snake in a small enclosure, it'll stay small. Nah. It really depends on how much you feed it. If you feed them a lot, they will get very big. If you feed them a little bit less, they will stay very small. So if you kind of what we try to mimic is their wild diet, which makes them grow a little bit more slowly than some people in captivity will basically feed them once a week.
This is a stitch watching her.
She's having a great time.
Yeah, she likes being in a movie theater, looking up, going, Anaconda, yeah, bring on the remake.
Yeah.
Here's a good girl.
A lot of people ask if our snakes are affectionate or if they really like people. The way that I try to describe it is that we're kind of like warm trees. We're something to climb on and we're something to get warm on. Other than that, they have no care. They just don't care. But they're never going to be like a dog or a cat where they just really want your attention and they want you to pet them. A snake, if you got a pet snake and you left it in its terrarium and just fed it and cleaned the cage and kept it at the right temperature and all that stuff, it would be totally happy if it never saw you. Just as happy as if you handled it.
Wow.
Fairly low maintenance. Yeah?
Do you have animals born at the museum? Are they mostly rescues or?
We kind of have a mixture. We don't have any animals at the moment, I believe, that were born at the museum. I could be wrong about that because I think sometime in the early 2000s there was like a brief ball python breeding project or something. So we still have a lot of ball pythons, but I think we've kind of gathered most of those over the years just from various people kind of dropping them off. So yeah, Diggy's a rescue, Kiara's a purchase, and we do have a pretty big mix. Most of the time if we do decide to purchase an animal, it's because we have a specific use for them. In the case of Burmese pythons, we teach a lot at the museum about native species and invasive species. Invasive species being animals that live in places where they're very much not supposed to be. And Burmese pythons are very, very invasive in Florida. And they eat all sorts of native wildlife. They destroy a lot of the native ecosystem. So we got Kiara to help us talk about invasive species in Florida.
Well, I think we're kind of at the limit here of our time. Thank you so much. This has
course.
really been fun. So I think best thing is if anyone does want to get a little closer, they can just come on down.
And please do stop by and see all of the things that we've done over the COVID times. We've been working on a lot of projects.
Well,
So, yeah.
thank you all for joining us for Anaconda. We
Thank
hope you
you.
enjoyed it.
Come here, you. Come on, Fatso. No.
Spurs, these little tiny things right here, those are vestigial legs.
Wow.